ASLA-NY, welcome. Welcome to the ASLA's presentation on living shorelines, advocacy and action. I'm going to stumble on the word advocacy every time tonight. As a local and national organization, ASLA advocates for policies and legislation that advance the design, planning, and stewardship of the natural and the built environment. In July of this year, U.S. Senators Kamala Harris and Chris Murphy introduced S-3087, which is the Living Shorelines Act, which creates a new grant program for the development of nature-based shoreline stabilization and protection projects. New York has lost over 30% of its shoreline since the very first wetland assessment in 1974. This loss is continuing and will only be exacerbated through sea level rise and continued erosion. The Living Shoreline Act provides funding for projects that can restore our shorelines and was a direct result of ASLA's national and local advocacy efforts. These projects will integrate with local ecosystems to provide protection for coastal communities. They'll be able to mitigate the effects of erosion, shoreline flooding, sea level rise, absorb the impact of coastal storms, and provide valuable coastal habitat where it has been lost. The term living shoreline is still new and is still very loosely defined. Projects vary from shorelines reinforced with man-made materials to shorelines reinforced with a mix of natural and man-made materials to larger structures built out of prefabricated structures. As designers, we are still working through questions related to the design of these shorelines. Factors such as wave action, fetch, subsidence, and navigational and recreational uses influence the function of these structures in ways that are still not thoroughly understood. Each new design gives us more information on how these structures perform and why. Today we have two speakers that will explore these issues with us, Sarah Morrison from Stantec and Rob Buchanan from the Billy and Oyster Project. Sarah is an associate in the Landscape Architecture Studio at Stantec. She's currently leading the Tottenville Shoreline Protection Project for the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. She also leads the landscape architectural design on numerous other living shoreline projects, including the Camden County Municipal Utilities Authority Living Shoreline Project and the shoreline restoration at West Pond in Jamaica Bay. Rob is a member of the education team at Billy and Oyster Project, working with students and community scientists on a wide variety of projects, including oyster research, water quality monitoring, community boat building, and environmental advocacy. He's a co-founder of the New York City Water Trail Association, an advocacy group for human-powered boaters, and former co-chair of the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program Citizen Advisory Committee. So I think it's going to be a really amazing presentation tonight. I really feel that Sarah and Rob have a lot of information. We're going to do two presentations, and then we're going to have a question and answer session afterwards. So please hold your questions until the end. And I'd like to introduce Sarah Morrison from Stantec.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight, and thanks, Elizabeth, for the introduction. I'm thrilled to be here tonight talking with all of you about an issue that's terribly important to all of us, clearly, in this room, but I think to the larger public as well, and celebrating what I think is a real victory, the Living Shorelines Act. And I think it's important in this climate to stop and celebrate the victories and the wins. So, there we go. A lot of the work that I do in our landscape architecture practice really centers around resilience and climate adaptation. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you about two projects that I've been lucky enough to work on that are living shorelines in a bit of the more sort of traditional sense of the word. And I'll get into talking a little bit about the word because, as Elizabeth mentioned, it's a little bit loosey-goosey. But I think that, I'm particularly excited about talking about these two projects because they're by no means the larger projects that I've worked on, and they're also not the projects that tend to get the most public attention. And so I'm particularly excited to bring these two projects to the forefront tonight. So before I start talking about specific projects, I want to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So let's start with talking about what the words mean. So unfortunately, living shorelines is kind of becoming one of those words like resilience that a lot of people are kind of throwing around and meaning a lot of different things. So a quick Google will show you that. I want to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So I've included this graphic at the top of the page, which many of you may be familiar with. It's from SAGE. If you're not familiar with SAGE, SAGE, check out their website. It's a wealth of great information. So this graphic is really just sort of showing a spectrum of coastal shoreline solutions from the entirely green to the entirely gray. The purely vegetated to the hard structures. What I think is interesting is to ask the question of where are living shorelines in this graphic? I mean, I think a lot of people would say that living shorelines are these three sort of examples to the left here, right? Because they're purely or heavily vegetated and they have a direct sort of interaction with the water. They also include here, though, beach nourishment and dune projects with vegetated plantings. So those kinds of projects are also clearly providing habitat, a different kind of habitat, but critical habitat nonetheless. I think that there's a third category, in my opinion, of living shoreline projects that are not represented in this graphic, and that's really sort of where the green and the gray really marry together and can create really exciting opportunities. So, that sort of points to projects. I think, the picture on the left sort of shows projects that we all kind of think about when we think about living shorelines. But I beg the question of, is the project on the right, the bottom right there, a living shoreline where there's habitat incorporated with structures like stairs and revetment stones? Maybe the planting doesn't directly interface with the water. Is that a living shoreline? I think it's a question that we all need to be thinking about, particularly as landscape architects. As Elizabeth mentioned, the Living Shoreline Act does define living shorelines in a way that leaves some possibilities open, which I think is really great and was a real win on their part. They do say that living shorelines should incorporate natural materials. No surprise there, right? But they do leave it open for the fact that they can incorporate things like stone or wood or concrete or other sorts of structures. And so I think it creates a really exciting opportunity for us as landscape architects to sort of help defining what a living shoreline is and really kind of push the boundary through some of these grant programs. So why are they important? Elizabeth touched on some of these things, so I'll try to make it brief. If you ask a layperson, well, clearly they're just more beautiful, right? It's far more beautiful. It's way more pleasing to look at something that's green and living than a concrete wall. But we all know that they also provide fairly low maintenance public open spaces. They allow for communities to sort of gather and fish and learn and have access to waterways that they've been completely divided off from for a very long time. So I think that's a sort of a critical aspect of these projects. Living shorelines are also exceptional at improving water quality, increasing resilience to both flooding and climate change, reducing erosion, storing carbon, providing critical habitats onshore in the intertidal zone and subtidal zones as well. So there's a complex web of sort of elements and information and analyses that go into the design of a successful living shoreline. One arm of that web is understanding the physical conditions of the site. The other sort of arm of that web, in my opinion, is understanding some of the common pitfalls that you encounter, not necessarily in design, but in approvals and in permitting, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But this diagram really helps to sort of summarize some of the coastal conditions which are often used to determine the best green or gray solution in some of these living shoreline projects. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to kind of point out some of the more important issues. Fetch is a word that's thrown around that I think maybe not everybody knows what it is. It's really sort of a cross-shore measurement that's perpendicular to the shoreline. It talks about if somebody's talking about fetch, they're talking about the sort of distance between the shoreline you're talking about and maybe the next sort of interaction with land. So it's about how much space over water is wind able to sort of gather energy and blow waves up to the shore. The tidal range, clearly, where's mean high water? Where's mean low water? Where is that interacting with your site? Storm surge. Another word that I think a lot of people don't really know what it means. It's the sort of temporary raised mean high water during a storm event. It's not the waves, it's when the water level rises, right? And wave energy is critical to these projects in many ways. And that's really talking about the height and velocity of the waves that pound the shoreline. So the physical conditions can be addressed through surveys, research, site visits. The other things that are critical to understand on these projects, from my experience, really just come through time and practice and experience. And I think that those are the kinds of things that we're all really working together, those of us who work on these projects, to help provide clarity on. It's not as easy to go out and find experts in these things. So I wanted to kind of highlight several of the stumbling blocks that our team has run into on a lot of these projects. Perceived risk. There's a perceived risk in using these types of solutions along shorelines, both by clients and by agencies and by the general public. People have a lot easier of a time to sort of put trust in a concrete wall to perform in a storm event than they do in an oyster castle or a marsh. And until we have a robust body of knowledge that supports the performance and the metrics of the success of these projects, that is going to continue to be a real problem for getting these projects even sort of into the minds of the clients, right? The permitting process. I'll talk more about this when we talk about the exact cases I want to get into, but the permitting for these projects is just lengthy and complicated right now. I think that is changing, but most existing regulatory processes are set up to sort of expedite hard traditional structures that have been tested. And this again goes back to it takes a lot of time to develop and test and prove the success of all of these types of solutions. So we're just going to have to get there. But, you're going to hear me talk about monitoring and the importance of monitoring many times tonight. And I think that that really is something that we as landscape architects need to start advocating for. Oops. Overlapping jurisdictions. I'll try to speed it up. But the water's edge is notorious for being the place where we cross from federal to state properties or state to city properties. And quite often who owns the land you're working on becomes quite sticky because living shorelines are sort of living amorphous shapes, right, that need to respond to topography and bathymetry, not property lines. And so it becomes even harder to sort of stay on your site with some of these projects. Small footprints in urban areas, we're all familiar with this problem, and this is one of the reasons why seeing the sort of more traditional living shoreline solutions in the city is very challenging. We don't have a lot of wiggle room, and so this is one of the opportunities I see as a really exciting moment for landscape architects to kind of really start pushing those hybrid solutions and pushing the boundaries on what is a living shoreline and monitoring. The process of getting these projects documented, both successes and failures, is incredibly valuable. And so I think that we need to figure out ways to make sure that that's happening. So the first project I'm going to jump into is in Camden, New Jersey. It's a project, it's about 1,000 feet, 1,000 linear feet along corrugated metal bulkhead of the Delaware River. And the client is the CCMUA wastewater treatment plant. So here you can see what it looks like zoomed in. The project area is, so it's that area over there covered in solar panels. They're quite progressive there for a wastewater treatment plant, and have been a pleasure to work with, I have to say. So it's bound by a bulkhead, a public fishing pier to the north, Phoenix Park, which is that sort of green space just to the south, a newly developed park for the area, and a sharp sort of elevation decline out in the water. It's bisected by a concrete pier, which is an outfall coming from the wastewater treatment plant. Phoenix Park there to the south, I want to mention, is it's a newly opened park, and it provides waterfront access for a community that has been cut off from the waterfront for a very long time. And so what you don't really see is that there is a walkway that goes along the shoreline, connects the park up to the fishing pier. So when this living shoreline is put in place, it's a real opportunity for this community who heavily uses that fishing pier to kind of really start to learn about the processes of what's going on in their water. The river has experienced changes over time, just like our rivers here in New York, much the same. Sedimentation, water quality issues, hydrology changes, which have drastically changed the landscape. All of that has contributed to a loss of natural shoreline habitat and a degradation of water quality. Because the Delaware River is not only tidally influenced, but influenced by wave action, boat wakes, storms, flooding, other high energy disturbances, most of the recent shoreline enhancements that are habitat focused have been hybrid solutions. So you'll hear me talking a lot about that here. So what are the goals of this project? The goals that were set forth from the beginning of this project were to develop a hybrid mosaic intertidal subtidal habitat along the existing bulkhead in front of the CCMU wastewater treatment plant, promote shoreline stabilization and erosion protection, provide water quality enhancement, enhance fish and wildlife habitat, and promote resiliency to sea level rise. The project is federally funded by a grant that was awarded to New Jersey DEP, so they're a critical stakeholder and have been heavily involved in the entire process during the design. Another critical partner on this project is in the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. They have been involved in this project longer than we have, sort of in helping to develop a master plan for the Delaware Estuary. And this was listed as one of their critical priority projects. So they've also been involved with the design. So they did some initial concept work, and as the team sort of solidified and we all came together, we started figuring out what the concept might involve, right? And so what you see here is high and low marsh, stone sills, and mussel habitat that we're looking to introduce here as well. The freshwater mussels and the rock sills would be enhanced by the marsh habitat. The sills would sort of provide the low wave energy necessary for the mussels and the marsh to establish properly. And here's an early view of what we did to show what that might look like from the walkway. But before we got too far, we sort of had to stop and validate that concept. And that's the thing with living shoreline projects, any project really, but particularly these, we constantly have to check the science. So the team studied survey data to understand the tidal fluctuations, which you can see in the upper left there. The sort of intertidal zone is quite small. There's not a lot of intertidal zone. So what that shows us and tells us is that in order to create a healthy marsh on this site, we're going to have to introduce fill. Would not be a negotiation if we're going to introduce a marsh. So we looked further out into the water to get an understanding of the bathymetry. You see here in the lower left, and you see that sort of steep drop, right, almost in line with where the outfall stops. And so that sort of helped us narrow in on the zone of where we were going to be influencing the site. We weren't going to creep out into the deeper channel. The coastal team did an analysis of everyday wave action, storm wave action, and wake waves from vessels that pass by on a daily basis as well, and determined that this is a high energy wave environment, which we all sort of knew, but they confirmed it. The goal of the project, however, is to develop habitat. It's not to reduce risk from wave action to homes, for example. And so what we then sort of discussed with the client was, well, do you want us to stop those waves, or are we just sort of introducing lower structures underwater to kind of calm the wave action and help us enhance the marsh area? And so that's what we ended up doing. So there were no sort of large protruding stone structures here. PDE performed a biological survey in June of 2017 to identify if we had any submerged aquatic vegetation or if there were any shellfish species on the site. And the good news was that they ran transects across the site, which you see here on the top, and we found 2 out of 24 sample plots had mussels present during the survey. So that was great news for the design concept. And we also found, highlighted in green up there on the right, an area with submerged aquatic vegetation. So that's great news. We have evidence. The science backed up the concept. And what you see here is the general sort of layout that we got busy working on doing the detailed design. So you see in the green area, the marsh area we were able to create by adding fill and adjusting sort of where those high and low tide lines would be. The sort of lighter gray area is where we're proposing to introduce mussel habitat, and I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like later on. And then the darker gray areas show the footprint of the stone sills, which would be submerged underwater. Here you see the darker green area, which would be the area developed for high marsh, and the lighter green would be the low marsh area. Because of the small area existing in the intertidal zone, like I said before, the development of high and low marsh requires a significant amount of fill to reestablish those water lines. I'll come back to this in a minute because it's a significant part of the story. But just to give you an idea, it was approximately 3.7 acres of river bottom that would be impacted. So here are our lovely mussels. Each adult freshwater mussel, just similar to oysters, filters 1 to 10 gallons of water a day throughout most of the year, which is quite significant. Freshwater tidal marshes filter nutrients, sediments, and pollutants from the water column, resulting in an improvement in water quality. I think we all know that, right? So what does it look like to establish mussel habitat? It's slightly different from oyster habitat, right? So the project would be installing 25 oyster pens, we called them. So they're shown here in plan and in section. They'd be constructed and established in a variety of configurations, which you can see over there on the right, sort of randomly placed but organized, and they would be below mean lower water. They're roughly 30 feet by 30 feet, and they're constructed of woody material, likely drift logs, sort of salvaged from community cleanup days from local river areas. The pens are anchored into place using ground anchor screws or concrete weights. That's sort of TBD. So where are we now? This is the interesting part. We're in the permitting process, and surprise, it's not gone as we expected. We submitted the application to both Army Corps and to New Jersey DEP for their review. As a reminder, New Jersey DEP was involved in this project all along as a major stakeholder, had significant buy-in in the concept. Everybody was really excited about the idea of establishing this marsh and mussel habitat. Great. They got the submission, and the volume of fill really spooked everybody. So we currently have 2 options. We can either provide an extensive alternatives analysis to prove that the marsh establishment, which would require fill, is worth the loss of river bottom, or we can eliminate the marsh. And the client at this point is tired of the permitting process and wants to move the project forward, as many of you, I'm sure, have heard with other projects. And so it looks like we may have to remove the marsh. And the reason I still showed it is because I think that's a really interesting part of the story, and it's a really good lesson. So what we may do is we will still establish the mussel habitat area, but what we would be looking to do is sort of establish these wooden terraced areas similar to this image on the bottom, where we would not be filling and we would not be planting, but we would be providing an opportunity for sediment accretion over time. DEP was fine with the marsh establishing itself, and for us setting it up to do so. And And so that may be what we do. Stay tuned. The next project I'm going to talk about is right here in Jamaica Bay, in an area that I'm sure you're probably all familiar with. We're on a team providing coastal engineering and landscape architectural design, with the end client being the National Park Service. So the project looks to restore the shoreline at West Pond. So the project is intended to protect the breach at West Pond that occurred during Superstorm Sandy. So I'm sure you all remember that West Pond there was a massive breach, which you can see in the right image there, which completely changed the dynamics of the freshwater pond in the middle of Jamaica Bay. There was much to do about whether or not to fill the breach, to let it remain. How is that going to change the habitat? What was most valuable? It went on for quite some time. The end of the story is they repaired the breach. That was not part of our design or decision-making process, but this project is to work together with the repair of that breach and the natural forces around in the surrounding habitat. So what you see here is a concept developed by the National Park Service to establish their goals from a sort of master plan perspective for this area. And the goals for the Living Shoreline project in particular are slightly different here: to control bank erosion, to restore wetland habitat, to maintain healthy ecosystems, stabilize the shoreline, protect from the 25-year storm, and protect the repaired breach. With these goals in mind, we started to develop a concept of what the solution might entail. And our team developed thoughts about reefs and areas of low and high marsh being part of this solution. But first, again, we had to stop and validate that concept before we took it any further. From the bathymetric survey, which you can see here on the left, we learned that there's a significant subtidal erosion, which took place in occurrence with the breach. It really established a sort of funnel for wave action right towards that already weak point. So we knew that we had an area where we would have to introduce fill to establish a marsh, and a particularly vulnerable area as well. Because of the fetch distance, which is quite significant there in Jamaica Bay, we can anticipate strong waves coming from the southwest direction, and the erosion of the breach event made worse in this area, particularly vulnerable. So we would likely want some sort of structural element involved in the hybrid solution we would propose. So we took a look at the wave analysis, communicated what 25-year wave protection would look like to the client, and to stop a 25-year or significantly dissipate a 25-year storm wave, you're looking at a pretty high structure. So what we came to the conclusion of, after much debate back and forth with the client, was that we would sort of dissipate the 25-year storm wave so that we could have a structure that was actually subtidal most of the time and only peaked out at low tide. So based on the project goals and the analysis of the physical conditions, we developed 4 alternatives as requested by the National Park Service. Their design process is very sort of regimented if you've not worked with them before. All of the alternatives attempted to lessen the amount of fill used, and we responded to the existing bathymetry and topography. So that's sort of guiding a lot of the sort of formations of the edges. This first alternative proposes high and low marsh and a core biolog as a less intensive shoreline stabilization measure there in the sort of continuous blue line. The second alternative is slightly more structured and robust level of protection. So there's a combined core log and rock sill in this solution. This solution requires more fill. It also provides more marsh. So that's something we had to talk about with the client. The third alternative is the most robust structural proposal with a nearly continuous rock sill along the entire stretch of the project with fish gap openings along the shoreline to allow even more marsh development, but you can see a significant amount of fill in the darker colors, the sort of dark blue, dark red, and darker green. The fourth alternative is an option we did not think would be favored. It requires the most fill. The alternatives provide no structural elements and is only made up of high and low marsh establishment. The alternative includes 9.5 acres of fill to establish enough marsh to provide the sort of level of protection that was requested. So which alternative did the National Park Service choose? The fourth one. Surprised again, the alternative with no structural elements and significantly more fill, the complete opposite scenario of our New Jersey case study, happening at the same time, the same sort of place and time, just across the state line. So where are we now with this one? The preferred alternative is selected. We're working on contracting for continued design services, but what I think is really interesting here is just to see if this is the preferred alternative continuing through the actual permitting process. Because as we learned in the Camden case study, DEP being at the table the whole time and supporting a concept didn't necessarily end up being the story once they saw the permitting application, right? And so we don't really know if this alternative that's preferred now will be the preferred alternative once we actually start going through permitting. And so I think the biggest lesson is what you hear people talking about all the time is just go early and go often and keep them engaged as much as possible. It's the best roadmap to a smooth process. So to conclude, I'm going to bring us back to this spectrum of living shoreline solutions and shoreline solutions, and I want to bring your attention to the projects across the bottom of the slide. Tonight I've focused mostly on projects at the far end of the living shoreline spectrum. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about these projects on the screen tonight here, but I wanted to end on them because I really believe that we as landscape architects have two sort of critical missions when it comes to living shoreline projects. And one is I really believe we must continue to push hard for and participate in rigorous quantitative monitoring programs for all of these projects that get implemented. Building that body of knowledge is so critical for us as designers, but also for the regulatory agencies to be able to have something to rely on to be able to permit these projects with any sort of level of confidence. I think we're moving in the right direction with the Living Shorelines Act requiring monitoring. I hope that that's the way that things move forward in the future. And I'm excited about projects that I see starting to pop up where that's already built in, like a project I'm going to be working on soon with Elizabeth in Alley Pond, where we're sort of looking at a case study of a bunch of different kinds of living shorelines in one site that can be monitored and measured in a way that I think will be really meaningful. And then the other sort of critical mission I'm going to pose for you tonight is I really feel like we must continue as landscape architects to push people out of their comfort zones in terms of how we're defining what a living shoreline is. We have a role in the design of all of these shoreline structures, from the very greenest to the very grayest. But I see a real sort of critical role for us in the design of that third category that's missing from this spectrum, where the green becomes married with the gray, and our sort of ability to synthesize and integrate our own sort of design thinking from our discipline and other disciplines, I think is really critical in designing these shoreline solutions. Making sure that there's a place for people is also critical and something that we, I think, have a responsibility to make sure is happening. A big part of what I do on a daily basis, and those from my office here will confirm that, is I push coastal engineers out of their comfort zone on a daily basis. And occasionally they push me out of mine too. But that's how we get to the really good stuff that solves a lot of the problems that we have in our urban areas. And so I strongly encourage you to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was great. I don't think landscape architects have ever had any trouble pushing people out of their comfort zone, so that's going to happen. I'd like to introduce Rob Buchanan next from the Billion Oyster Project, who's going to talk about a softer side of these structures.
So I just push here, is that right? Up? No, down. Oh, okay. I'm pushing them all.
Okay.
So I'm just going to push down. Okay. Be really careful about that. Okay, well, hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. That person on the right, Danielle, was supposed to give this talk, and she is a teacher, and she had a lecture that she was bound to do tonight, so she asked me to come and talk. And so the talk will probably be a little bit different. She's a restoration manager at Billion Oyster Project, and much more familiar with the technical aspects of these projects. I'm on the education side, so my talk is going to be softer. I'd like to run through what we do briefly and then move on to offer some perspective on park design from our standpoint and also from my standpoint. I got into this whole thing as a boater, as a human-powered boater, as a rower in the harbor, and so I have a long-standing familiarity with the harbor and from the water side, and I have strong feelings about edge design, and so some of those may come out, and I'll try and make clear that they are my thoughts and not representative of Billion Oyster Project. One interesting thing about BOP is the discussion within the group of how to develop advocacy positions, and obviously it's a complicated one, and we're just starting that. We wrote a letter about the Army Corps plans for storm surge protection. That was the first letter that we've done. So anyway, I'll get to that. Why are they smiling? That is an e-concrete disc that has oyster spat, young oysters growing and growing well, and they're very enthused about that successful experiment. So quickly, I think most of you probably are familiar with this, so I'll just buzz through these. This is actually a picture from Florida, but it is conveys a sense of what parts of this harbor probably looked like in 1609. And in fact, if you look at some of the old maps, this is the Rautzer map. This is Liberty Island, and behind it's labeled Oyster Bank. So that whole thing was one giant oyster flat. Kind of amazing to think. I think the estimate is 220,000 acres of oyster reefs in New York Harbor, the most important oyster reefery in the world at the time. And these middens are still here. If you've been to Croton Point Park, way up in Westchester near the salt fresh line, that tip of that park, 60 feet high, is all oyster shells. So they're there. If you dig in a lot of places, you'll still find them. This is oystermen on the East River. These are not houses, but barges. And on so the oyster sloops would back in, offload, and then on the front side, people would walk up and buy their oysters. And I just like this slide because a barge is, and that whole approach, a modular approach to moving things around in the harbor, is something we don't do enough of. We could do a lot more with barges. And the same, I mean, this is kind of a land barge, but these little push carts and oyster stands were very popular, penny a piece. Everybody ate them. And we could probably do a lot with those, too. In fact, some students built one last year at the Harbor School. Anyway, what happened? I think we know the story over harvesting, dredging. It doesn't get talked about that much, but that was definitely a big part of it. And there's a lot of pressure to dredge more in this harbor, so that's something we're looking at, thinking about. We don't have an advocacy position on that yet, but maybe someday. And then obviously the big one was pollution. So, 100 years later, we are starting to put these oysters back in the water. This is down in Staten Island, a little pond at Lemon Creek Park, and we call this bagged shell reef, where we stack these things in like cordwood and let them grow. Here's the sort of vital statistics on the organization. We're not that old, but we do have 30 employees already, pretty big budget. A lot of that's payroll, mixture of grants, and our own fundraising, which is pretty robust, if you know about the Billion Oyster Party. Our official count on oysters that we put back in the harbor is 28 million. We have a big schools program. That's a hard number. We sort of settled on 70. But we have developed a whole curriculum for middle school science classes. We have 9 boats. One of them is in good operating condition. And we have one van that runs. And there's our mission, and we have 2 arms of the organization. One is restoration, and the other education. And it was difficult to say in one sentence, so that's what we came up with after weeks of wordsmithing. Okay, and this really, the Billion Oyster Project is an outgrowth of, it started as the nonprofit arm of the New York Harbor School, which is a public high school on Governor's Island, about 600 kids. Really the only thing that happens on Governor's Island in the off season. And the founder of that school, Murray Fisher, thought that it would be a good idea to start a foundation to support the school. There are a lot of extra resources involved in maritime education. So he created something called New York Harbor Foundation, and that's who we are. Legally, we're the New York Harbor Foundation, but we are doing business as the Billion Oyster Project because that is the initiative of ours that really took off and occupies most of our energy. But legally, we're the New York Harbor Foundation. So these are students at the school, and they're in the aquaculture program, and they are lowering these super trays full of oysters through gaps in our eco dock, which also doubles as a training dock, and that's an old Department of Transportation buoy tender that another part of the school uses for training on the water. So these kids really have an incredible number of opportunities available to them, and some of them appreciate that. And we all double in our jobs as we're working hard on oysters and developing education for middle schools. But we also work closely with students at the school. It's a big part of our job. Okay, oysters, this is what they look like. They don't look like they look in restaurants. They grow in clusters. They grow on top of one another. They as larvae, swim around for a couple weeks, but then they settle on something, and that's where they stay for the rest of their lives. And the thing they like to settle on the most is oyster shell. So they form these clusters, and those clusters form reefs. And the traditional explanation of an oyster reef is that it's sort of the temperate zone equivalent of a coral reef in the tropics. It's the keystone species. It provides habitat for everything else. So we are trying to figure out, and this is definitely still, we don't know. It's an experiment, and we were trying to figure out how to make these things grow and how to try and form the kernels of these reefs and see if we can get them to grow out into fully fledged reefs. But it's only been 5 years, and we really don't know how that's going to work yet. So lots of different approaches, and I'll go through a couple of them later on. Here's a sort of portrayal of the services, ecosystem services that oysters provide. But really, if the 3 main talking points are, why are we doing this? Well, first of all, for habitat and for biodiversity in the harbor. If you can establish these reefs, you're going to bring back everything else, the fisheries and the birds that depend on that keystone being there. And that is going to make the harbor and the estuary a much more productive place, productive biologically. So that's probably our primary goal. Water quality is the thing people always talk about, and it's true that oysters filter. I mean, you hear this 50 gallons a day figure. I don't know. They filter water. They take suspended solids out of the water, put them in a tank with algae in it. The tank will be clear in a couple of hours. But I think we want to be careful not to overstate that by putting oysters in the harbor, we're going to deal with our sewage pollution issues. We're not going to deal with our sewage pollution issues through oysters. We're going to have to deal with those issues through the sewer and everything that we're going to do around the sewer. So I think sometimes that people get a little ahead of the game, maybe in 100 years, but definitely not now and not in the immediate future. It's just not, the problem's too big and there aren't nearly enough oysters to cope with it. And then the last argument, which is appealing now, is this idea of shoreline protection. If you could reestablish big coastal beds like that, there would be some kind of impact on those, on wave action, and would be a protective layer. Again, that's probably a long way off, though, until we can really get there. So that's the argument. All right, so restoration, what are we actually doing? Let's just look at, here's some places where we're doing different stuff. You saw a picture from down here at Lemon Creek. We'll talk a little bit about this living breakwaters thing. We have nurseries here and up in the Navy Yard. That just means that hanging in big stacks, we're growing oysters out, and when they get big enough, we'll move them to one of our other reef sites. We've got a really big one here, our biggest effort here in Head of Bay. If you take off from JFK, you can see that. It's 3 long piles of shell on the bottom and 1 long row of crushed toilets. That was put down to see if oysters had a preference between those things. We don't know yet. We're going to monitor that next year and see. And then some other spots, Bush Terminal Park, and we're just about to start this one, Soundview at the mouth of the Bronx River. And then up at the Tappan Zee, we didn't put oysters in, but we put oyster shell in hopes that it would attract wild oyster larvae. So we'll see how that goes. But that was a really big effort, and I've got some pictures of that in a second here. Okay, so this is a really, I mean, this is the Head of Bay barge. We purchased this shell up in Massachusetts, and it really was an industrial scale operation to bring this stuff in. And the DEP partnered on this. So this was, I don't know, $1 million or something of oyster shell and oyster shell transportation anyway to get this started. And then above those beds of shell, we put these things called oyster grows, which are reversible. It can be, when you're growing oysters in cages like this, they can become fouled with tunicates and sponge colonies and things, and the water won't be able to pass through the oysters. So every month, in theory, you come along and you flip these things over, let them stand right side up for a day. That kills off the fouling growth that's on there, and then you come back and you flip them back over. It sounds really easy. It's really hard work, like the most physical, nastiest, coldest, hardest work you can imagine. And these things were always, they're on a rope. It gets windy out there, the rope is always breaking. It just, so anyway, finally we got permission just to free the oysters and drop them onto the beds, and that's where they are now. So we'll see. The oyster grows are no longer in place. These are gabions. This is another strategy. It's a rebar cube welded by students at the harbor school. They did 422 of them. There were a lot of jokes about forced labor, but there's a lot of truth to that. And these were all put on barge and taken up to the Tappan Zee and arranged in long rows next to the old Tappan Zee bridge. And we will see what those attract, what settles on them. I mean, the hope is that we get a big set of wild oysters. Okay, and then a smaller and different kind of an emphasis is this community reef program. And these are the sites that we have right now, mostly in Brooklyn, one down here in this far end of Jamaica Bay. And these are just places that are all distinguished by water that you can wade in and out of. So easy access points close to communities that are of interest. This one, you can see people in the water right under the Manhattan Bridge there. That is no longer accessible for us because stuff started falling off the bridge. I don't know if anybody lives in Dumbo, but you know they had to put the scaffolding up to protect people going to the park. Bolts and things were falling out of the subway, and so they've they've asked us not to go back to that reef, and we're trying to move it further south in the park right now. But anyway, this is what a community reef typically might look like, a rebar, we call it a filing cabinet. It's just a big rebar, kind of a rectangle, and then we hang these things, which we call files. They're really hard, just like files you put in a filing cabinet, and those are filled with oysters. Sometimes with oysters, sometimes just with shells, to see if the shell will attract back. And so to monitor them, and this is really a community exercise, a community group or school group will go out and pull the files out, bring them to shore, measure the oysters, measure the growth, measure all the other stuff that might be living there, and then put them back. And that's, you know, our monitoring is done by volunteers and by students. That's one of our, that's how this work of restoration turns into education and into community science. Okay, and then this is, I think most of you know about this project down at the southeastern tip of Staten Island. But our job in this is to place oysters onto these structures. And this is a kind of a rendering of how far, somebody was asking tonight how far out they would be and how much room there'd be in between, but something like that. And then the actual, we're going to take these e-concrete discs. I don't know how spat is going to be attached. I don't know about this, outside my area. But anyway, these giant cubes will be stuck onto those breakwater structures, and we'll see what happens. So we have at least we have a hand in that project. Okay, and this happened this fall up and down the Hudson and around into the Harlem a bit, but I don't know if you can see, but these are little tiny oysters that have formed, and they form on anything that happens to be hanging there. This is actually a plastic card that we had in one of our cages, and they just set in great abundance, and that's really what we're hoping to see. That's what we want. If we could have a set like that every year, all over the harbor, you know, it seems like we could have oysters again in great abundance. Anyway, it was a very exciting thing to happen. We can't take credit for it. We think it was probably, we don't know if they were our oysters or just a wild, it's hard to imagine that the few amount of oysters that we have, especially up in that part of the Hudson, were responsible. But anyway, it was a very exciting thing. Okay. Education, this is what I do. This is our basic middle school science kit right here. It's called an oyster research station. We give them to you. He's a teacher. He puts it in. There's 10 clusters of oysters. His students, here's another class in East Harlem. They come, they pull the cages up, they pull the oysters out, and they measure them. They do that twice a year, spring and fall, or more if they want to. They enter the data onto what we call a platform. And then they do comparative studies of the oyster growth in their neck of the woods with other parts of the harbor. And that constitutes a form of computer science, or at least data training, that qualified us for an NSF grant, which was really substantial and really funds our education program. So we're really interested in the information part of this, and that's how we got there. At each site, we hang these signs to try and prevent people from vandalizing them, because they're pretty attractive to fishermen or just curious people. They pull them up. So we get a lot of, and that's one of my jobs, is going around in a boat and replacing lost oysters or cages that have been cut. It's an ongoing process. And obviously the DEC is worried about people eating these things. So you don't always have a really good place to hang the cage. You don't want the cage on the bottom, because predator snails will climb in and eat the oysters. And so this is in Bushwick Inlet in Greenpoint. We created this float, student-built float, and we hang a cage off of each corner of it. And to monitor those oysters, the students have to get into a canoe and paddle out to the float and bring the oysters back to shore. This is what monitoring looks like, pulling the oysters out, measuring them. This is Long Island City, and using calipers, which in itself is a good skill for a middle school kid to master. And I'm just throwing this in because it's now part of our education program, and also I supervise it, but we're now building boats in Sunset Park with middle school after-school groups, and this is another strategy for getting them down to the harbor and using the water. We call this the Brooklyn Oyster Dory. It's actually a workboat, and we can and have used it to throw those oyster files in. But it's another education strategy that appeals to funders because of its sort of STEM connections. Okay, I want to just look closely at one place that has gotten a lot of attention from us and also from Parks Department. A lot of work went into this place. And then I want to end by looking at a couple of other sites around the harbor that I think are of interest. And maybe that will lead to some interesting conversation. So, Bush Terminal Park and Sunset Park right next to Industry City. This is what it looked like before the restoration efforts started. You can see all the big Industry City warehouses back there. It was old piers. And then here's a vertical view. So it was transformed into kind of a natural area out here, restored wetlands here, and an inner lagoon and an outer lagoon, and they're connected by a kind of an isthmus that at low tide is dry, but at high tide, obviously, it's not. The same thing with those two openings to the harbor. And you can see, this is in the inner lagoon. I think you can see our files there, the community reef structures there. This is, I'd like to take credit for the water being this clear, that the oysters filtered it. I don't know that that's true. I think it was just a really rare clear water day in the late fall. But it's great to see that, anyway, water that clear. And and you can see behind Finola here, you can see the restored wetlands, which look really good in that picture. And they actually have done really well. There's some geese issues there. And the biggest issue is these giant pieces of log that wash in and kind of roll over that thing. But it's done well. And there's this is a really interesting part of it. This is in the outer lagoon, but there's just it's not quite a beach, but it's kind of gravel, not beyond gravel. I don't know what you call it. Small, it's probably a word for it, right? I don't know. Anyway, cobbles. They're sharp, but anyway, it's a usable beach. You can get in and out of the water. Kids can throw rocks from it, and you can land boats on it. So this is a really valuable thing for us because once those kids made that boat, they launched it here, and we created a little community boating program, weekend program with kayaks and canoes and this dory, which we hope to keep going with and build more in the next years. Anyway, I think this is a really great example where a lot of people with a lot of different agendas have so far come together and been able to get things done in a collaborative way. So that it started as a natural resources group, is that right? As a wildlife habitat project, and it has morphed into an oyster restoration project, and now it's an actual water access, community water access spot. And all those things, I think, can coexist with careful planning and good communication. So I think it's a great example, and we need people in Sunset Park are really lucky to have this park, but this is what we need more of, places like this. And to me, if Billy and Oyster Project can help bring places like that into existence, it's really more important than us succeeding in our wild dream of recreating 200,000 acres of oysters. But by opening up these spots, I think we're getting where we need to go anyway. So I'm really happy with that. Now, anyway, this is just a list of all the things that happen there that some of them involving the community. Okay, and then I just want to close with a few slides that I hope are provocative and also give my perspective on a couple of things. So, this is to a boater. That thing, you guys call it a revetment or something like that. I call it riprap. That is just deadly. And you can't get out of a boat and up it, and you can't come down and get into a boat, and you can't send school children down it. It's just a no-go zone. There is some life in it. It's not, completely dead, but it's just, it's really anti-human. And So when I see that, and this is one of those new towers in Greenpoint, it's really, and I'm not speaking for BOP, but for me, it's a very painful thing to see more of this happening along the edge. In design, when you're thinking about school kids, this is really a big deal. The railing or the fence is really, really important to a lot of people. Principals of elementary and middle schools, for example, do not want their kids to touch the water. So in some cases, a railing is really a good thing because otherwise the kids wouldn't even get that close. But a lot of the time it's, it's like that. The teacher is on the outside pulling up the oysters and they have to be behind the fence. It's, anyway, it's just a reality. Another thing, one of my pet peeves is like architectural renderings of waterfront parks that show the water as a uniform sheet of blue, as if, everything stops at the edge of the land and then it's just blue and it's just flat and nothing's going on. And so if you're doing a project, go out at low tide. And this is that low tide, like the extreme low tide, like 2 days ago. And this is Hudson River Park. That's Pier 26 right there. And all that water just blew out because of the wind. And you could see all this stuff on the bottom. You could really see the bottom, which is really rare to see it. And it's amazing what's down there. There's just so much junk and the old signs of construction. And anyway, the water needs to be understood and depicted as having, it's got its own topography, and it should be shown that way. And that's how a waterfront design should start, with understanding what is the underwater contour like. Okay, here's a current project. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, called the ESCR, East Side Coastal Resilience Project. And the original plan, which was arrived at after 4 or 5 years of talking to the community in this beautiful community-driven design, was this: that the FDR would get a wall would be built here, and you'd have a kind of a berm that would slope back down, and basically the park would be left to be a floodplain in flood events. And that might kill some trees. Seems likely it probably eventually would. But you move with that, you replant with species that are more salt tolerant, and the park is just this evolving floodplain-like thing. Well, anyway, that got thrown out the door, and now it's a backwards tilting plain with the FDR here, and the wall raised by 8 or 10 feet on the outside, and it just seems. Yeah, it's really wall building and not soft edge building. It just seems like a step back, and I've been to a couple of meetings and I've heard the explanations, and it just seems very, very value engineered, and based on these very kind of short-term financial calculations, that this actually, the upper one, would be less expensive to build, and probably in our, anyway, whatever. So there's that. That's an interesting plan. And then here's another one that I think is really complicated. This very cool artist, David Hammonds, wants to, and the Whitney Museum wants to raise money for him to put this ghost pier structure on the south side of Gansevoort Peninsula. It's the only piece of Hudson River Park that faces south, and therefore the only place where you could really build a beach or a protected wetlands. And the rendering that the Whitney produced shows the structure being put down into this current edge, which is riprap. And I think that there's definitely room for that sculpture to be there, but that it probably shouldn't go in until the park has really thought about how it wants to design this edge. And I just don't think leaving the riprap there forever is a good solution. I think it's just an opportunity to do something really great, to build a beach or a beach and wetlands, and we should design that first, and then we should put the sculpture down, or design them together, or better yet, get the Whitney to pay for the whole design process, which they should do as responsible stewards of the waterfront. So we'll see where we get with that. Okay, and then the last thing is, this is our sort of team before we installed at Lemon Creek, and it was really, really nice to stand under a tree because it was a super hot day. So I just wanted to say that to all of you landscape architects. That's it.
Rob. Thank you very much. I think one of the things that I really appreciate about our profession is that we get to collaborate with so many different kinds of people. Every project has some incredible, unique element that allows us to reach out to a partner like Billy and Oyster Projects and really make something that is amazing and worthwhile. We're going to do a little question and answer. So Sarah, you want to come up? We don't have a microphone, so you're going to have to speak up. And let me know if you have a question for Sarah or for Rob, or just a general comment related to the presentation tonight. Okay.
Hi, thank you. They're both great, and I have a lot to say about that East River Park. But a big question is, because the East River Park, for example, they're raising it, the new thing is to raise it 8 feet high, and they said that's only good against, well, everybody, also, it seems like there is no coordination between storm surge, sea level rise, rain events. So like they're doing the park for storm surge, and they're raising it 8 feet high, 2 miles, 8 feet high of soil. But they said that's only good for, but now, last week the report came out that the sea level is getting warmer and raising higher much faster. So maybe they said it's good for 50 years before it's not even going to stop storm surge. So let's say it's good for 40 years, but now if you're doing these living shorelines, at what level are you designing them to? If it's going to be buried, if your high marsh is going to be low marsh in a few years, like what level do you design those to start with?
It's an excellent question, and there's no simple answer. And one of the things that is, I think, eternally frustrating on all waterfront projects that have some sort of level of resilience or climate adaptation thinking is that each project is addressing some sort of different level of protection or risk reduction or adaptation or future projections coming from different sources and addressing different concerns. And so, there is sort of a lack of a holistic approach that I think is going to be detrimental fairly soon.
That's what I mean. So this all seems a little bit futile right now, and I mean, all of it seems futile because it's raising. So maybe instead of thinking of treating the shorelines, everybody just has to start thinking of making everything floodable and unfloodable. Like every first story of every building or everything should just be floodable. You know what I mean? And
or thinking about the old sort of daylighting the old stream paths, because that's where the flooding is going to go into the city. So where can you do that? Pick those spots and start to do that.
But I don't know, but I mean, I think there just has to be a much bigger picture. I mean, I think it's great they got that law, but I don't even see how it's possible now to make it work. I mean, make it that it's going to work in 10 years from now. So I just think that there has to be a big picture that nobody's talking about. It's like the elephant in the room, kind of.
I agree. I think that with marshes, I'm going to say that specifically, not living shorelines, because there are so many, but with wetlands and marshes, the thinking is that they will be particularly adaptive to sea level rise, right? But because the water lines can sort of shift, the habitats can shift with the water lines, but they have to be able to have space to do that. And so we have to be careful even talking about marshes and wetlands being adaptive to climate changes, because, well, sure, in a perfect world, but they have to have the space to do so. And so, for example, when they're butting against the bulkhead, they're not going anywhere when the water rises, right? So they're butting up against the bulkhead. They'll change for a while, and then that will be that. So it's an excellent point.
So if you are designing the high marsh line, are you designing like 4 feet higher than it would be? Like, are you giving it that extra start?
We usually design our high marsh to be higher.
Yeah.
So that we have room for marsh migration. Yeah. You usually design it, you give it a little, you get at least a foot or two so that it has room to migrate upward as the water levels rise. But I mean, it is kind of one of those questions that has answers that people don't want to hear. And the answer is you can't live a lot of places. So that's why it's such a politically difficult question to give us a consensus on. It's a really hard question. You have a question?
Kind of following up on that, but a specific project in Camden. So I was curious which agency was pushing back on, is it in the federal or state, on not doing the fill? And then also with the revised plans you had, were the sills, were you able still to maintain the breakwaters and sills, or is that sort of also thrown aside, and you think that the design you have now can sustain the wave action that's going to continue?
Great question. The real pushback was coming from New Jersey DEP. They were most spooked by the bill discussion, although I think that everybody was a little bit spooked. It was mostly an issue for them. The sills are still in question. Like I said, the permit isn't complete. They've asked us to go back and do some rethinking. They sort of hinted that we might not have those sills there when we come back, but it wasn't a firm, you should not have the sills. I think, that's part of what our coastal engineers are working on right now is, first, is it even feasible or reasonable to think that the sediment is going to accrete to in this location? It's an extensive study to figure that out, right? So it's a whole different project. And can that happen without the sills? If that happens, will it last without the sills, even if it can happen? And so we don't have those answers yet, but we now are going back to the drawing board to try to get those answers to at least be able to create an opportunity on the site.
So when you say they were involved early in the process, like, can you talk about how early they were involved?
And this is not unique to New Jersey, New York.
No.
It's just so.
Anywhere.
Like 65 or was it like 50% documents or like?
No. Way early on, at some of the initial stakeholder meetings, they were at the table.
Vision meetings?
Sure, they were not at every team meeting that we had, but they were at the beginning to set the standards and the assumptions and the goals, and they were there for sort of pivotal moments along the way.
And to clarify why they have issues with the fill is because they consider mudflats or benthic areas habitat. So you're taking away a particular type of habitat, obviously to create another kind of habitat, but they don't see it as an equal swap. So that's part of the issue that we struggle with living shorelines, is that we're proposing fill, and it's difficult.
I'm just curious, can you talk a little bit more about the maintenance, both sides of it, whether it's oysters or whether it's landscapes? Because again, maintenance is a constant challenge on the city agency side for various things, and obviously these are intended to be sort of natural habitats that evolve over time and sort of do what they do. But you spoke to challenges with the ropes breaking and like dealing with how you maintain these things even from a research perspective. And it seems like a very challenging issue that always gets sort of left to the side or left to the end or forgotten about when I'm thinking about the design.
Well, it's a huge part of it, and the way we explain it and justify it is to say that we need to keep monitoring this. So we call it monitoring basically, but it really crosses over into maintenance. We have to be out there, and it depends on the structure. Of course, those gabions at the Tappan Zee, our plan is to do nothing except to go back and send some divers down in 3 years' time and see what's there. But with the bag shell, which tend to move a lot, and certainly with those little cages, it's constant maintenance. And then that's just staff time, and it's got to be part of the plan. So.
Yeah, and I think the maintenance and monitoring should be sort of integral with these projects, and I do think, I'll say it again, I think that the monitoring programs for these types of projects are critical, and the sort of establishment of critical points when developing the monitoring plan for folks to go out and check on certain aspects of the project gives an opportunity for folks to go out and do some maintenance. If you set up the opportunity for monitoring to take place after significant storm events and define what those storm events are, then at least you know that that's going to happen. But nobody has any budgets for maintenance or monitoring, and so here we are. So of course it's not maintenance free, and you have to check on the vegetation, you have to check on how much debris is sitting, knocking things out of the way, and if there's structures, that they're structurally stable still. So clearly, it's not this lower maintenance maybe than mowing or weeding or something that people generally think of, but it is required.
We need a good diesel mechanic.
Or maybe the monitoring
Well, it is.
Many do.
Yeah.
The one that Sarah's working on for parks does have a monitoring component to it that's grant funded. So, I mean, but that's not always the case. Parks is big on monitoring. And so I think it's, and I agree with you. I think that's really the only thing that's going to help us push this through the permitting hurdle that we have is being able to monitor it and say it does actually substantially have an ecological uplift. I mean, that's important.
It can't just look different.
It has to, yeah. That's
One of our challenges is using students and volunteers to do the monitoring, and so the data then is different and of variable quality, and so figuring out how to gauge that kind of data, is it still useful, or are we just sending students out there to do this as kind of an exercise? And trying to find a balance where it actually is valuable and we can use it is tough. We've really simplified the monitoring for that reason, to try and let them have a real role.
Figuring out which party, which agency or owner is going to have ownership of the monitoring also is complicated, because many of our sort of project delivery setups in the city are set up to deliver the project and is constructed, and then they are not part of that project anymore. Someone else takes over the ownership. And so the communication of who's going to own and who's going to monitor, is it the same entity, is it not, has to happen so early on in the process. It's terribly cumbersome, and one of the reasons why it's not happening.
I'm just curious, as a follow-on to that, have you seen any new technologies that make monitoring easy? Obviously, there's all these tech giants that are coming out with new things all the time. I'm just curious if it's starting to seep into this field, and maybe that's more on the academic side as opposed to the project side. But I'm curious.
We have one of the Harbor School is a CTE school, career technical ed, and one of the tracks is ocean engineering, and they, as sophomores, they build underwater robots. And the idea, it's just kind of this eternal dream that never quite happens, but the robots are supposed to get good enough that we can use them to do the monitoring for us. But
Not yet. Any other questions?
What percentage of Stantec's projects are of this type?
Oh gosh, that's a really hard question. In this office, I mean, we're a global firm, so it's really hard for me to answer. A significant, almost all of the work that I do in our office is this. We're an office of 20 landscape architects here in New York City. We are working on a lot of projects like this in the South as well, so in response to the oil spill and a lot of the storms we're seeing down there. Our coastal engineering practice is building, and as that happens, the coordination between landscape architects and the coastal engineers is becoming highly integrated. We've recently acquired firms in New Zealand that they also work in this area as well, so it's growing a lot recently, but no idea.
Okay. I'm sure you've had success in other parts of the world with the marshmallow and like this. Your designs on the river remind me of Hawaiian fish ponds. They have enormous amount of material to work with, like lava, but they also have a very strong, ocean force to work.
Yeah. We actually just went after an on-call contract, looking at some of these kinds of solutions as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for coming in. I want to thank Rob and Sarah.